Hey there. I am making this video to show you how to make a graph. In this Bio 156 lab, there'll be several occasions where you need to make a graph using the data that you and your group or the class collects from an experiment. So let's jump into this. I'm presenting here an example of a graph that I put together in PowerPoint. And this graph is labeled, and the various components, I'm going to show you what they are and where they go, etc. So we're usually going to start off with some data. So here's a data table over on the side that I made up. This isn't an experiment that I actually did, but something I've imagined in my mind. So imagine you were wondering about what would happen if you changed the amount of baking powder that you put into your favorite cake recipe. And you were understanding that baking powder makes a cake rise and get, like taller and fluffier, but you really wanted to understand just what effect the baking powder has on the cake's rising. So in this experiment, because you are changing the amount of baking powder to see what it does, you're manipulating or changing that variable. The amount of baking powder is the independent variable in the experiment. The independent variable is always one that you're changing or manipulating to see what it does or what happens. So in this experiment, we're changing the amount of baking powder in different cakes from 0 teaspoons up to 2 teaspoons to see what happens. Then we go ahead and make these cakes, bake them in the oven, and when we pull them out of the oven, we're going to measure the height of the cake and see how much the cake rose. And so because we're measuring the height, that's what we're collecting data on. The height of the cake is what's called the dependent variable. We're wondering, does the height of the cake depend on the amount of baking powder? So height of cake is the dependent variable. So we end up having this data, or these data. If we add 0 teaspoons of baking powder, we basically get a flat cake just from the dough baking. If we add a 1/4 teaspoon of baking powder, the cake rises a little bit, 3.5 centimeters. If we do a 1/2 teaspoon, it goes up to 4 centimeters, etc. You can see what happened. Eventually, when we get to 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, the cake's not rising anymore. So we make graphs in order to show what the data are showing, to give a picture, to give an image that kind of pops out and tells us and shows us what happened in the experiment. It's a visual presentation of the data. Now, when we make a graph, the standard in science is to put the independent variable on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis. And remember, the independent variable is the thing that we're changing or manipulating in an experiment to see what it does. So, because we're changing or manipulating the amount of baking powder, that's the independent variable. So you would write or type the name of that independent variable below the x-axis, and then in the parentheses, you put the units that the variable is measured in. So in this case, it's teaspoons. Okay. So we cross the x-axis appropriately the amount of baking powder that we measured in the experiment, that we manipulated, anywhere from 0 teaspoons up to 2 teaspoons. And you always put your numbers across the axis in even intervals. So the amount of space between each one from 0 to 1/4, 1/4 to 1/2, 1/2 to 3/4, etc. is all evenly spaced. Let's turn our attention to the y-axis, the vertical axis. We always in science put the dependent variable, the thing that we're measuring or recording as data, we always put that on the y-axis. And in this experiment, what we're measuring or recording as data is the height of the cake. Does the height of the cake depend on the amount of baking powder that we've added? That's what we're wondering. And just like with the amount of baking powder, you put the units that you measure the height of the cake in, so centimeters, you put that in parentheses. Okay, so we've got everything laid out on the x-axis with the name of the variable and the units, amount of baking powder, teaspoons. And we've got height of cake, the dependent variable, with the units, centimeters. Now we're ready to plot our data. So I already did this, just to make it a little easier in making this video. So for 0 teaspoons of baking powder, the cake was 3 centimeters in height. So you come over here, 0 teaspoons of baking powder, 3 centimeters, there's the data point. For a 1/4 teaspoon of baking powder, the cake was 3.5 centimeters. So we go to a 1/4 teaspoon, you go up vertically to 3.5. You plot that data point. 1/2 teaspoon, it rose 4 centimeters. So 1/2 teaspoon, it rose 4 centimeters, etc. You go through the data table, you plot all your data points, and there you go. We're starting to get a visual presentation of our results. So then what we might do is draw a line through the data points, or as close to the data points as we can. So I'll go ahead and do this. So this helps us to kind of see, okay, as the amount of baking powder is going up, the height of the cake is increasing faster, but then at some point, adding more baking powder isn't making much of a difference, and in fact it levels off at 7 centimeters and it doesn't get any higher. So in this case we have the relationship is kind of a curve. For most of the graphs that you're going to do in this class, the relationships would be more of a straight line, but we'll get to that. So there we go, we've got a visual presentation, but we need a title. So the title's written above the graph, on top of the graph. And for all the graphs that you do in this class, you probably can begin it with the words effect of, and then you name the independent variable, effect of amount of baking powder on, okay, and then you name the dependent variable, height of cake. So there you go, there's a title that describes what this graph is showing. The effect of the amount of baking powder on the height of a cake. So anybody looking at this graph and reading that title would know exactly what the graph is showing. You wouldn't want to write a vague title like cake experiment or baking powder experiment. You generally want to mention both of the variables, the independent and the dependent, in your title. So that's pretty much it. This is how you make a graph, and we'll be doing this in our boiling point experiment, and we'll be doing it later with a couple other experiments. So you get some practice in presenting data, interpreting data, and becoming more of a scientist.